So I came to Western Michigan University in 1992 as an assistant professor. So I've been here 23 years now. I did my doctoral degree at the University of Massachusetts, where I studied North American archaeology. And I've been a professor of anthropology for several years now here at WMU. The site of Fort St. Joseph was established right along the St. Joseph River in a very strategic location. It's not only on the river, and the rivers in the 17th and 18th century were the highways that were used to transport goods and people, but also it's near an important land route, essentially the old Sauk Trail, sort of from Detroit to Chicago, you could say, along what is today US 12. And also in proximity to the portage that connected the St. Joseph River and the Great Lakes riverine system with the upper reaches of the Kankakee River, which flows into the Illinois, which flows into the Mississippi drainage system. So that little short stretch of land near Niles is about 5 miles, and it essentially was this very, very important location. So the French established their settlement there first as a mission in the 1680s, and then as a commercial center and as a place where there was a small garrison of about 8 to 10 soldiers in 1691. And essentially, there's very limited documentation from this period. So understanding daily life at Fort St. Joseph can only be accomplished through the archaeology. So what we're seeing here is evidence of the first interactions between the French and their native allies. And the work that we do sheds lights on this and helps us to understand what some of the challenges were that both sides, if you will, faced, and then the very distinctive fur trade society that emerged from the blending or the commingling of these two different cultures, who basically lived in peaceful relationships on the St. Joseph River for nearly a century until the British showed up. Well, one of the things that we've been able to learn through the work is that there are actually intact deposits. There are undisturbed archaeological deposits at the site that demonstrate to us that this was indeed the location where they established their settlement. And as we look carefully at these remains, we're beginning to find the outlines of houses. So we're learning about how they constructed their buildings, how large they were. The contents of the buildings begin to tell us something about the actual occupants of the buildings, because there are no maps, there are no detailed descriptions of what went on at Fort St. Joseph. So all this information derives predominantly from archaeology. The other thing, the documents that do exist provide us with sort of a broad narrative of political aspirations of commandants and maybe some population estimates, these sorts of things. But the archaeological record, the materials that were made and used and discarded on a daily basis, tell us more about the texture of daily life. So we actually get a sense of how people used material goods, not the way they necessarily were intended to be used, but the way they actually were used. So for example, one object that we found that's quite intriguing is what we would all recognize as a thimble. A thimble used for sewing, to protect one's fingers from being pricked by a needle. And yet this thimble that we found has a hole in it, intentionally punched in it. And we have ethnographic examples of native peoples using thimbles and other cone-shaped, cuprous, copper-based objects that they would dangle from the fringes of their garments, from moccasins. They would have put them on various bags that they would have carried, and these little objects would bang up against each other and make a pleasing tinkling sound. So this is quite interesting to us, because when Native peoples envisioned, when they first saw these thimbles, they didn't necessarily see them in the same way as the European makers did. In fact, they imagined them as being very, very different types of objects, decorative objects. And so the way that people manipulated objects and the way that they modified them for their own, towards their own ends, are what we really can see from the archaeological record. So it gives us a very different insight into what life was actually like in the 18th century and what people were doing on a daily basis, as opposed to the documents that are more prescriptive, but in fact don't necessarily shed light on that aspect of the people.